Imagine stepping into Buckingham Palace in 1840. Velvet curtains drape from gilded windows, marble staircases gleam under gaslight, and chandeliers sparkle like captured constellations. It looks like the pinnacle of royal perfection, until you notice the faint stench of chamber pots tucked just out of sight. Yes, even in palaces that reeked of power, they also reeked of something else. That's the paradox we'll explore tonight. Glittering halls that dazzled the world, but with leaky pipes, freezing rooms, and an army of servants scurrying below stairs to keep the illusion from collapsing. Welcome to palace life, grand, impressive, and quietly miserable. Before we step into the strange, drafty, and gilded world of Victorian palaces tonight, a quick note. If you'd like to listen to these stories without ads, offline, and with a bonus insider episode, you can find the ad-free collection linked in the description and pinned comment. And while you're here, what time is it where you're listening from? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because if you drift off without clicking that button, this whole story will sink into the algorithm's oubliette. Step closer now. We're leaving the modern world behind and entering the palaces of Victorian Britain, buildings designed to impress visiting dignitaries, frighten political rivals, and overwhelm anyone foolish enough to compare their wallpaper to the Queen's. The Victorians had several of these palaces to shuffle between, because nothing says stability like moving your household, your furniture, and a few thousand servants from one drafty hall to another. At the heart of it all was Buckingham Palace, that sprawling neoclassical pile of stone in London that became the beating, if occasionally leaky, heart of royal life. When Queen Victoria took possession in 1837, the place still felt more like an ambitious country house that had overindulged than a true royal headquarters. Its plumbing was inadequate, its kitchens were laughably far from the dining rooms, and the acoustics made private conversations travel farther than gossip at a village well. But with Victoria's determination and Albert's eye for order, it grew into the monarchy's nerve center, the palace where politics, family life, and public spectacle collided under one roof. A short ride away stood Kensington Palace, older, smaller, but dripping with history. This was where Victoria was born in 1819, and where she spent her suffocating childhood under the notorious Kensington system, a regime of rules so strict they made convent life look carefree. By the Victorian era, Kensington had lost its status as the main royal residence, but it lingered as a family space and a memory-haunted backdrop. If Buckingham was the shopfront of the monarchy, Kensington was the attic, holding trunks of history, family drama, and the occasional ghost story whispered by servants in drafty corridors. Further afield was Windsor Castle, the ultimate weekend retreat, where medieval towers loomed above the Thames, and every visitor was reminded that the monarchy was not just ornamental, but ancient, fortified, and still standing after centuries of squabbles. Windsor was less about comfort and more about spectacle. Vast halls echoed with state banquets, and the cold stone walls made sure you never forgot that monarchy, at its core, was about endurance. If Buckingham was the modern face of Victoria's monarchy, Windsor was its granite backbone. And then there was Balmoral, the Highland escape Victoria, and Albert bought in 1852. Balmoral was supposed to be the fresh air antidote to London's soot, smoke, and politics. Here, the Queen could dress down, meaning perhaps only 5 layers of clothing instead of 9, and imagine herself a simple countrywoman, while surrounded by enough staff to populate a small village. Albert busied himself redesigning the estate, making Balmoral a vision of baronial romance. Turrets, stags' heads, and miles of Scottish heather. The irony, of course, is that the locals could rarely get within sight of the Queen's rustic playhouse. Balmoral was rural life with all the hardship removed, except for the servants, who still hauled water, chopped wood, and made sure the fires didn't smoke Her Majesty out of her fantasy. So there you have it, 4 palaces, each with its role. Buckingham for politics and pageantry, Kensington for family memory, Windsor for continuity and display, Balmoral for pretending life was simple when it absolutely wasn't. Each building said something about monarchy, and each came with its own set of quirks, challenges, and hidden smells. And here's the real trick. These weren't just backdrops for royal life. They were instruments of control. The Victorians understood that a palace was theater. Every marble hall, every gilded chair, every over-decorated ceiling was a stage designed to communicate wealth, power, and permanence. But like all theater, it needed stage hands, curtains, and the occasional trapdoor to hide the mess. For every ballroom gleaming under chandeliers, there were kitchens filled with sweat, smoke, and shouting. For every polished staircase, there were back passages where exhausted servants staggered under coal scuttles. Now, let's immerse you in the scene. Picture yourself arriving at Buckingham Palace for the very first time in the 1840s. Your carriage rattles up to the forecourt, wheels crunching on gravel. Guards in scarlet coats stand stiffly by the gates, rifles glinting in the London haze. Ahead, the palace looms, a blocky expanse of Portland stone, its windows dark against the evening sky. There is grandeur, yes, but also an odd flatness. It doesn't yet have the ornate facade we recognize today. Instead, it looks more like a country gentleman's house that wandered into London and decided to stay. As you climb the steps, the smells hit you first. Beeswax polish, coal smoke, damp wool, and faintly, something less pleasant that the footman will politely ignore. Inside, the entrance hall stretches ahead, chilly despite the fires. Marble busts glare down at you as if unimpressed by your coat. The air is heavy with candle wax and perfume, a mixture designed to overwhelm the senses and distract from the draft seeping through the windows. Servants bustle past, some in livery, some in plain black, carrying trays, logs, folded linen. They don't speak unless spoken to, but their silence is deceptive. Every glance, every shuffle tells you this building is alive, its machinery hidden but constant. Bells ring in distant corridors, summons for maids, footmen, cooks, and valets. Somewhere below, the clatter of pots echoes up from the kitchens, absurdly far from the dining rooms they're meant to serve. And in the midst of it all, you realize something. This palace isn't just a home, it's an ecosystem. A small city where the royal family live in staterooms designed for intimidation, while hundreds of others, unseen, unnamed, work themselves weary to keep up appearances. The palace breathes because they keep it breathing. Of course, from the outside, the illusion is seamless. When Queen Victoria steps onto the balcony, the crowd sees only grandeur. They don't smell the damp corridors. They don't hear the rats skittering in storerooms. They certainly don't see the laundry women burning their hands on boiling linens just to keep those gowns white enough for the next ball. That's the contrast you need to remember as we wander through these palaces. Official state grandeur on one side, private reality on the other. It's easy to imagine Buckingham as a cozy family home. After all, Victoria raised 9 children there. But don't be fooled. Nothing says home sweet home, quite like a residence that requires its own team of rat catchers, ice keepers, and coal porters just to make it marginally livable. So, settle in. We've only stepped through the front doors, and already the illusion is cracking. Ahead lie the rituals, the smells, the spectacle, and the sorrow of palace life in the Victorian world. You're inside now, and there's no leaving until we've wandered the gilded halls and peered behind the curtains. So, here we are at Buckingham Palace, the crown jewel of Victorian life. Though, if you'd visited in its early days, you might have thought it looked more like an overfed townhouse than the center of an empire. That's because it literally started as one. In 1703, the Duke of Buckingham built a large townhouse on this spot, no doubt pleased with himself. A century later, King George III bought it as a comfortable family home for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their children. It was still cozy enough then. Cozy in the royal sense, meaning large enough to get lost in, but small enough that you might eventually be found. But when George IV came along, subtlety went out the window. He decided Buckingham House needed a glow-up. And when monarchs say glow-up, what they mean is massive construction project that someone else will pay for. Enter John Nash, the architect with big dreams, expensive tastes, and absolutely no ability to stick to a budget. Nash tore into the old house with relish, adding wings, classical facades, and enough gilding to make Versailles blush. He envisioned a palace fit for a king, or at least fit for George's ego. And here's where it gets fun. Nash overspent. Massively. He was supposed to create a respectable palace. Instead, he practically doubled the costs, plastering ornamentation on every surface. His bills spiraled so high that Parliament eventually fired him. Imagine explaining that one. Yes, Your Majesty, the architect has built you a palace so extravagant we can't afford it. Also, he's out of a job. Nash ended his career disgraced, but his fingerprints are all over the bones of Buckingham. By the time Queen Victoria inherited the palace in 1837, it was still more of an ongoing experiment than a fully livable home. The kitchens were absurdly far from the dining rooms, so far that by the time food arrived upstairs, it was often cold. The chimneys smoked. The ventilation was poor. Water pipes leaked. Servants muttered that the whole building seemed designed to annoy them personally. You, walking through those early halls, would have felt the mismatch immediately. The marble staircases glistened under candlelight, but the air was cold, the corridors drafty. Doors didn't quite fit their frames, so every winter wind found its way inside, whistling like an uninvited guest. The building looked regal from the outside, but inside it felt like a half-finished set. And yet, it was here that Victoria insisted she would make her throne. She and Prince Albert threw themselves into reshaping the palace. If Nash's vision was theatrical, Victoria's was practical, well, mostly. She saw Buckingham not only as a family home, but as the headquarters of her reign, and that meant changes. One of the most famous was the addition of the central balcony. Albert proposed it in the 1840s, and it quickly became a defining feature of the palace. Why? So the monarch could appear before the crowds outside, waving to troops or acknowledging cheering subjects. And here's where we apply a bit of sarcasm. Yes, they basically spent fortunes extending the facade, all so Victoria could wave at people from a window. A costly architectural project, justified by the occasional royal hand flutter. But it worked. That balcony became a stage for monarchy itself, a symbol still used today whenever a royal family member decides to appear, preferably in good weather. Meanwhile, renovations pressed on. New wings were added, service corridors expanded, and staterooms decorated with heavy drapes, gold trim, and chandeliers so large they seemed almost aggressive. The Victorian aesthetic loved ornamentation. Every surface had to say something, even if that something was, "Look at how much money we spent on this plasterwork." But remember, luxury didn't erase discomfort. You would still shiver in long galleries where the fires never reached. You'd still notice the smell of damp carpets on rainy days. And you'd still hear servants muttering as they trudged up staircases with trays, knowing full well the roast goose was cooling with every step. And yet, the palace grew into its role. With each renovation, with each tweak, Buckingham transformed from an awkward house into a genuine royal stage. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they didn't see the leaky pipes. They saw gilded mirrors reflecting endless light. They heard the stomp of guards' boots in the courtyard. They watched Victoria step out onto her balcony and felt the symbolism wash over them. For you, though, listening here in the quiet, it's worth pausing to imagine what life in those corridors really felt like. Imagine yourself trailing behind the Queen as she inspected the work. You smell fresh paint mingling with coal smoke. Dust still hangs in the air from newly cut stone. Servants rush to cover cracks with rugs, to polish stair rails until they gleam, to make sure no visitor ever suspects that the grand palace was, in truth, still patchwork at the seams. That's the strange truth of Buckingham's evolution. It was never really finished. It was, and remains, a construction site with better curtains. Every monarch since Victoria has tinkered with it, adjusting facades, redecorating rooms, adding or removing ornaments. By the time George V reclad the outside in Portland stone in the early 20th century, it finally began to look like the Buckingham Palace we recognize today. But in Victoria's time, it was still very much a work in progress. And that's the theme of this chapter, the palace as monster. It consumed money, time, and patience. It grew and grew, sprouting new wings like a stone hydra. It demanded servants in endless numbers, workers in endless shifts, architects with endless drafts. It was the very symbol of monarchy, imposing, impressive, and completely impractical. So next time you see that famous balcony, remember the price of it. Not just in money, but in effort. Behind every royal wave was scaffolding, paint dust, shivering servants, and frustrated cooks. A balcony, yes, but also a monument to how monarchy insists on spectacle, no matter the cost. Life in a palace wasn't just about towering ceilings and gold-plated banisters. It was also about ritual, endless, carefully choreographed rituals that dictated every hour of the royal day. You might imagine that behind closed doors, a queen or king could finally relax. But no, this was monarchy in the Victorian era. Every moment, from waking to sleeping, was meant to be seen, managed, and of course, performed. Take the royal morning. In theory, this is a private moment. You wake up, rub your eyes, stretch a bit, and perhaps grumble about the weather. Not if you're Queen Victoria. Her mornings began with the lever, a ceremony borrowed from earlier royal courts. A select group of attendants entered her chambers to oversee the act of getting ready. This wasn't just about putting on stockings. It was theater. Every role was assigned. One servant fetched the dress, another held the shoes, another arranged the gloves. If you were especially privileged, you might even hand the queen her comb. A great honor, apparently, for the chance to stand there in awkward silence while she yawned. Now imagine you're one of those attendants. You'd stand stiff and silent, holding the Queen's shoes, praying you didn't sneeze or drop them. Every eye would flick toward you if you fumbled, and your courtly career could end in that single clumsy moment. Romantic, isn't it? And let's not forget the hair. In an age when wigs and elaborate coiffures were practically architectural projects, servants didn't just brush hair, they engineered it. Powders, pins, and oils turned a simple head into a statement piece. If you were nearby, you'd catch the sharp tang of pomade, the dusty sprinkle of powder settling on clothes, and the faint smell of scorched hair when curling irons were heated too long by the fire. The end result looked effortless, but the process was anything but. Once dressed, the Queen could make her appearance. But here's the trick. Appearances weren't reserved for banquets or state events. Every part of the royal day was a kind of performance. When she moved from her chambers to breakfast, servants and courtiers lined the corridors, bowing or curtsying as she passed. Eating itself could be a public event, with onlookers observing the royal family as if they were part of a play. Imagine sitting down to breakfast with an audience taking notes on how you buttered your toast. And then came the levees. These were formal gatherings where male courtiers and officials could be presented to the monarch. Picture a long line of men in starched collars, each practicing their bow, each praying not to trip on the carpet. The Queen, or earlier kings before her, would sit in state, receiving them one by one. It sounds impressive, but in practice it was repetitive, exhausting, and a little absurd. One wit of the time compared it to a conveyor belt of sycophants. But sycophancy was the whole point. The levee reminded everyone exactly who held the power, and exactly how small you were in comparison. Evenings had their own rituals. The coucher or going to bed ceremony might sound intimate, but of course it wasn't. It was another performance. The Queen undressed and readied herself for sleep in front of attendants who managed the process step by step, unfastening gowns, folding garments, placing slippers. Servants lit candles and extinguished them in turn, as though the simple act of bedtime required a supporting cast. Privacy, as you understand it, simply didn't exist. For you, standing somewhere in those rooms, the effect would be strange. On the one hand, you'd be overwhelmed by the grandeur. Candles flickering on polished mirrors, fabrics whispering as gowns were folded, jewels glinting even as they were locked away for the night. On the other hand, you'd notice the awkward silence, the tension in every movement, the sense that everyone was waiting for the monarch's nod to signal that the day was over. And what about the servants themselves? They weren't simply staff. They were actors in the royal theater, each with their part to play. The valet who buttoned a waistcoat, the dresser who powdered a wig, the page who carried letters. Every role reinforced hierarchy. Even the most mundane act, like presenting a candle, became a symbol of closeness to power. Which is why these jobs were so coveted. Holding the Queen's gloves could elevate your family's status. Carrying her fan could open doors in politics. A pair of shoes might be your ticket to influence. Strange, yes, but true. Sarcasm aside, these rituals did serve a purpose. They reminded everyone day after day that monarchy was about continuity and spectacle. You might complain that the palace was cold, the plumbing unreliable, the food late. But when you bowed in that morning ritual, or watched the coucher at night, you were reminded of the weight of the crown. Repetition built legitimacy. Ceremony created awe. For Victoria herself, these routines were both a burden and a comfort. She sometimes wrote in her journals about the fatigue of endless duties, the weight of always being watched. Yet she also embraced the structure, the rhythm that palace rituals imposed on her life. It gave monarchy a sense of permanence, an impression that everything was stable, even when behind the scenes it was anything but. As you listen now, picture yourself moving through these ceremonies. You shuffle forward in the line for the levee, heart pounding as you approach the queen. Your bow feels clumsy. Did you bend too far? Not far enough? The chamber is hot with candles, but you're sweating for other reasons. Later, you hold a garment, waiting for your turn to step forward, to perform your tiny part in the great machinery of monarchy. You're exhausted, but you can't yawn. Your stomach rumbles, but you can't shift your weight. You're a piece of furniture with a heartbeat. And yet, despite the awkwardness, despite the lack of privacy, these rituals worked. They created a rhythm for palace life, a constant beat that tied courtiers, servants, and monarch together in a single performance. Without them, the palace would have been just another house with too many rooms. With them, it became something else entirely, a living stage where power was displayed in every bow, every curtsy, every carefully timed flicker of a candle. Romantic, isn't it? And before you drift off, remember, if you don't subscribe, these rituals vanish into silence again, just like the servants' history forgot. Click it, or let them disappear all over again. Let's pause for a moment. Up until now, you've heard about marble staircases, chandeliers, and the carefully staged rituals of royalty. But here's the part no painting ever captures, and no polite courtier ever mentioned above a whisper: the smell. Yes, palaces looked magnificent, but they also carried an unmistakable aroma, a heady cocktail of roses, candle wax, damp wool, smoke, and yesterday's dinner left just a little too long in the corridor. Buckingham Palace, in its early decades under Queen Victoria, was glamorous from the outside and surprisingly unsanitary on the inside. The problem was plumbing, or rather, the lack of it. For all its gilded mirrors and velvet curtains, Buckingham had no proper system of drains when Victoria first took up residence in 1837. Instead, courtiers and servants relied on chamber pots. Convenient? Yes. Hygienic? Not even close. Pots were tucked under beds, stashed in closets, and emptied into cesspits or into the Thames, which, by the way, was already being used as the city's all-purpose garbage chute. Imagine yourself walking down a long corridor lined with heavy curtains and plush carpets. It looks grand enough to impress any foreign ambassador. But as you move further in, there's a faint tang in the air, a reminder that someone's chamber pot has not been emptied quickly enough. The carpets do their best to hold the scent. The curtains soak up the damp, and the candles only make everything smell faintly smoky. It's less palace of splendor and more giant upholstered sponge of odors. Victoria and Albert, to their credit, tried to modernize. Flush toilets were installed gradually, though never quite fast enough to keep pace with the needs of hundreds of residents and servants. And these early toilets weren't the reliable conveniences you know today. They often broke down, overflowed, or froze solid in winter. It's one thing to be a queen. It's another to try and host a diplomatic reception when the pipes are gurgling ominously somewhere beneath the floorboards. And here's the real kicker. The palace was so large that even when plumbing worked, water often had to be carried long distances to reach the right rooms. Servants scurried up staircases with buckets, hoping not to spill on the polished floors. Imagine the humiliation of being the one to trip, leaving a trail of water, or worse, across the marble. So how did people cope? Perfume. Not just the delicate dabs you imagine behind ears, but gallons of the stuff. Servants sprinkled scented waters around rooms, burned incense, and polished furniture with waxes infused with lavender and lemon. Courtiers drenched themselves in cologne until the air shimmered with competing fragrances. The result wasn't fresh air. It was a chemical battlefield. Perfume battled candle smoke, chamber pot fumes, and damp walls. No wonder visitors often described the palace air as thick. And the dampness. Oh, the dampness. Victorian palaces were notorious for their heavy fabrics. Thick velvet curtains, wall tapestries, and carpets designed to impress. But all those rich materials trapped moisture. On rainy London days, the palace felt clammy, the air heavy. Your shoes might squeak on wet floors. The tapestries seemed to sag slightly, holding on to centuries of smoke and damp. The great palace looked magnificent, but it smelled like a place that never quite dried out. Sarcasm helps here, doesn't it? Buckingham. The palace that smelled like a mix of roses, candle wax, and yesterday's dinner left in the hall. Not exactly what the tourists imagine. Of course, this wasn't unique to Buckingham. Windsor Castle suffered its own issues, with primitive drainage and drafty halls that made odors linger. Even Balmoral, the royal escape in Scotland, had its fair share of damp smells and creaking pipes. The truth is, palaces were simply too large, too overstuffed with fabrics, and too dependent on human labor to ever feel properly clean. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a visiting dignitary. You're arriving for a grand dinner. You enter the state dining room. Candles blaze from chandeliers, silverware gleams, and dishes are piled high. But the journey there has taken you past corridors that smell faintly of coal smoke and unwashed wool. You sit at the table, trying to ignore the draft seeping through the old windows. A servant pours your wine, which is delicious but suspiciously not quite cold enough. All around you, courtiers fan themselves, the mixture of perfume and sweat almost dizzying. And yet, when you look up, you see gilded ceilings, magnificent art, and the Queen herself presiding over the spectacle. And so you smile, because to complain about the smell would be to admit that palaces are, in fact, just very large houses with very human problems. By the mid-19th century, efforts to modernize helped somewhat. Albert's interest in efficiency meant plumbing was improved, ventilation increased, and some rooms finally began to feel livable. But the image of perfection was always stronger than the reality. The palace was theater, and theater relies on illusion. From the front gates, Buckingham looked like the perfect symbol of monarchy. Inside, it was part glamour, part grit, and part chamber pot. And as you drift along in this story, remember, history often leaves out the smells. Paintings give you marble, silk, and light. Memoirs describe jewels and banquets. But if you really want to understand what it was like to live in a Victorian palace, you have to add the invisible layer, the scent of daily life, the imperfections, the quiet discomfort hiding under the velvet. That's where the truth lingers, even when the perfumes have long since faded. Behind every royal palace, behind every chandelier and velvet curtain, was an army, not of soldiers, though there were those too, but of servants. An invisible force of more than 1,000 men and women who kept the whole machine running. Without them, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington, and Balmoral would have ground to a halt in a matter of hours. When you picture a palace, you probably imagine queens and princes, glittering balls, and the odd royal wave. But if you were really there, you'd be more likely to encounter a butler hauling coal, a footman carrying a tray of hot chocolate, or a maid silently replacing candles that had burned down. The royal family may have been the stars of the show, but the servants were the stage crew, the set designers, and the electricians, all rolled into one. And here's the remarkable part. You weren't supposed to see them. The great paradox of palace life was that servants had to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Corridors were designed so they could slip in and out without disturbing the view. Narrow back staircases wound through the walls like veins, carrying maids and footmen unseen. Bells rang constantly, tiny coded signals that told a servant where they were needed and how quickly. Each bell had its own tone, tied to a specific room. If you were a footman, you might hear a sharp chime and know instantly that the Queen's sitting room needed attention. Imagine yourself as one of these servants. You spend the day listening for bells, ready to dart into action. You move through cramped passages that smell of wax and soot, while just above you guests admire ballrooms that seem to stretch forever. You keep to the shadows because your job is to make life appear effortless for those who never see the effort. You don't exist until you're summoned, and then you must appear instantly as though conjured. The jobs themselves ranged from the ordinary to the absurd. There were laundresses who boiled mountains of linens day after day, their hands raw from soap and starch. There were housemaids who dusted every cornice and polished endless miles of banisters. There were cooks and kitchen boys, sweating over roasts that had to travel half a palace before reaching the table. And then there were the specialized roles, the ones that sound almost comical to modern ears. There were rat catchers, employed specifically to deal with the palace's rodent population, because nothing ruins the majesty of a state banquet faster than a whiskered guest scurrying across the floor. There were ice keepers, whose job was to carve blocks of ice from ponds in winter and store them in underground ice houses, so the royal family could have chilled drinks in summer. And yes, there were champagne keepers, men responsible for ensuring bottles were properly cooled and served at just the right moment. Sarcasm feels almost unavoidable here. Yes, someone's entire career was making sure the champagne was cold, and you thought your job was pointless. But for the Victorians, this was no joke. These roles were vital. They allowed the palace to maintain its illusion of perfection, to keep up the appearance that life inside those walls was seamless, graceful, and untouched by anything so vulgar as rats or lukewarm champagne. Hierarchy extended below stairs just as rigidly as above. The butler and housekeeper ruled over their domains with almost royal authority. Under them, footmen ranked by height. The taller you were, the more prestigious the job. Laundry maids, scullery maids, chambermaids all worked in strict order, each answerable to someone above. The palace was a miniature society, a reflection of the rigid class system outside its walls. And yet, despite their invisibility, servants shaped palace life in profound ways. Gossip trickled through corridors faster than official reports. A valet overheard royal conversations while brushing a coat. A maid caught sight of private letters while tidying a desk. These invisible workers often knew more about the royal household than any courtier in full view. They were the hidden memory of the palace, the people who kept secrets even as they scrubbed floors. For you, if you imagine standing among them, the rhythm of the day would be relentless. You'd rise before dawn, answer bells from morning until night, and collapse in a tiny attic room while the palace still hummed below. You might spend years perfecting the art of moving silently, of opening a door without a creak, of lighting a fire so quietly that no one stirred. And if you did your job well, no one ever noticed you were there. That was the cruel irony. Success meant invisibility. And yet for some, palace service was a path to status. A footman in royal livery drew admiration simply by walking the streets of London. A lady's maid or valet could wield quiet influence, whispering advice to their employer or controlling access to the Queen. Entire careers were built on proximity, on being the invisible hand that adjusted the crown. So when you picture Victorian palaces, don't just imagine the gold leaf and chandeliers. Imagine the human machinery, the boy running with a jug of hot water, the maid folding damp laundry in a steaming room, the rat catcher lurking in the basement with traps. Imagine the constant ringing of bells, the shuffle of footsteps in unseen corridors, the exhaustion of people whose names you'll never know. Because that's what a palace truly was. Not just a home, not just a stage, but a machine powered by human labor. The royals may have been the face of Victorian grandeur, but it was servants who kept the lights burning, the floors polished, and the illusion alive. If the grand halls of Buckingham were the stage, the royal kitchens were the boiler room, literally. This was where the magic, or at least the steam, was made. And while the Queen's guests marveled at glittering chandeliers and silver-plated tableware, the truth of the palace's grandeur was being sweated out, quite literally, in the bowels of the building. Banquets were the centerpiece of Victorian palace life. These weren't modest affairs with a roast and 2 vegetables. A proper royal feast could involve 70 dishes per course, laid out in the French style, à la française. That meant everything appeared on the table at once: soups, fish, poultry, meats, pastries, desserts. An overwhelming display designed not just to feed, but to impress. Imagine yourself descending into the kitchens an hour before such a banquet. The heat hits first. Fires roar in massive hearths. Spits turn with whole sides of beef, and copper pans hiss with stews bubbling away. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meats, butter, onions, and sweat. Always sweat, dripping from cooks working at impossible speed. Knives clatter on chopping blocks, boys scurry with trays, and above the din, a master cook shouts orders that echo off stone walls. It is chaos, but carefully directed chaos, like a symphony with cleavers and ladles for instruments. Menus themselves were ambitious. The Victorians, under Albert's influence, embraced a mix of French finesse, English heartiness, and even German comfort food. One banquet might offer delicate consommé, followed by a platter of roast partridge, then a pudding stuffed with suet and, just to round things out, macaroni and cheese, imported from Hanoverian tastes. Yes, even in 19th century Buckingham, mac and cheese made its appearance. Royal, of course, but still mac and cheese. Now picture what it felt like to be one of the kitchen staff. You're a scullery maid, sleeves rolled up, hands raw from scrubbing copper pots until they gleam. You glance up as trays of pies, mince pies stuffed with meat, not the sweet kind, are whisked past you toward the dining room. Steam rises in your face, carrying with it the tang of gravy and the sharpness of wine sauces. Your back aches, but the dishes keep coming. For hours. Meanwhile, upstairs, the Queen sits in state. Dishes are paraded before her and her guests like trophies of conquest: roast swan, turtle soup, elaborate sugar sculptures shaped into castles or crowns. But here's the twist. Most of that food was never eaten. The sheer volume made it impossible. Much of it went cold while courtiers admired the arrangement. Servants then whisked away untouched platters, scraping the remains into bins or distributing scraps to lower staff. And after all that, the Queen herself might take only a few bites of soup before turning to conversation. all for a dinner where the queen might just pick at the soup and leave. Romantic, isn't it? The spectacle, however, mattered more than the taste. Every dish was a statement. The abundance showed the wealth of the monarchy. The variety displayed Britain's reach across the globe. Pineapples from the colonies, wines from Europe, spices from India, all laid out as evidence of empire. Guests were meant to be dazzled, not fed. Of course, the logistics were a nightmare. The distance between the kitchens and the dining rooms meant servants carried trays up endless staircases, through winding corridors, balancing silver platters that grew colder with every step. By the time a delicate fish dish reached the table, it might be lukewarm at best. The solution? Cover it with sauce and hope no one noticed. But imagine yourself now in the dining room. You've taken your place at a long table draped in linen. Candles blaze overhead, throwing soft light on golden chargers and crystal glasses. The air smells faintly of roasting game, but also of beeswax polish and perfume. You wait as servants line up, synchronized like a ballet, before setting dish after dish before you. The sound is soft but constant. Porcelain clinking, silver scraping, the shuffle of footmen moving as one. And what of the servants who stood behind each guest's chair? They remained upright for hours, silent except when summoned, eyes fixed forward. Their task was to anticipate your need before you even asked, to refill your glass, to replace your plate, to whisk away crumbs without disturbing your conversation. You were never meant to notice them, except when something went wrong. These banquets could last for hours. After the initial spectacle of 70 dishes, courses were cleared and new ones brought in, often with subtle shifts in theme. The first might be heavier, filled with meats and gravies. The second might lean toward lighter fare, fish, poultry, fruit compotes. And then dessert, the final showpiece. Towers of jellies trembling on silver stands, fruits carved into elaborate shapes, and ices flavored with exotic syrups. The ice, remember, harvested in winter by the keeper of ice and snow, stored underground for months so that summer guests could enjoy chilled puddings. You'd taste a spoonful, perhaps two. The conversation, the music, and the sheer presence of the Queen were meant to fill you more than the food ever could. And as the evening wound down, as candles guttered and smoke curled up into the ceiling, the palace itself seemed to sigh. Another performance complete, another night where spectacle triumphed over practicality. Down below, of course, the servants were still at work. Dishes had to be scrubbed, pans scoured, leftovers sorted, fires doused, floors mopped. While the Queen retired to her chambers and courtiers drifted homeward, the kitchens rattled on into the early hours, and when dawn came, the cycle began again. So, the next time you imagine Buckingham as a place of elegance and serenity, remember the reality: sweat, smoke, and 70 dishes that no one finished. The grandeur upstairs only existed because of the chaos below. If palace kitchens were the engines of spectacle, then palace wardrobes were the display windows. Fashion in the Victorian era was never just about clothing. It was about power stitched into silk, wealth woven into lace, and status sewn into every bead and button. Queens, princesses, and ladies-in-waiting floated through ballrooms in gowns that sparkled under candlelight, each dress sending a message louder than any speech. Look at me. I am important. I am untouchable. Let's start with the gowns themselves. Imagine Queen Charlotte's dresses, and later Queen Victoria's, draped in ornate silks, satins, and velvets. These weren't clothes in the modern sense. They were constructions, architectural projects that required planning, precision, and more often than not, a team of people to get a woman into one. Whalebone frames and crinolines spread skirts outward until women seemed less like people and more like ships under full sail. Sleeves puffed, bodices constricted, hems swept the floor like ceremonial carpets. And here's where you come in. Imagine yourself standing in one of those dressing rooms. The air is heavy with perfume and powdered starch. Two maids tug laces tight across a bodice, while another kneels to adjust hems. The queen stands patient, or perhaps impatient, while her body is literally reshaped into the fashionable silhouette of the day. You might be the one holding gloves, waiting for the exact second to step forward. You might feel your arms ache as you hold a jeweled tiara just so, terrified to let it slip. This was no simple routine of getting dressed. It was theater, choreographed with the precision of a ballet. Every piece had its moment. Stockings, petticoats, corset, crinoline, gown, gloves, jewels. A mistake wasn't just embarrassing, it was a breach of palace order. Servants often whispered cues to one another. Now the sash, now the fan. Think of it like a relay race, but with higher stakes and far more silk. But here's the hidden truth behind all that glamour. Someone had to maintain these impossible garments. Silk may look immortal under candlelight, but it frays, stains, and rots just like anything else. Enter the laundry women, the unsung heroes of palace fashion. Their world was not candlelit ballrooms, but boiling basins, steaming linen, and hands red and raw from lye soap. Day after day they wrestled with mountains of clothing, lace collars blackened by coal smoke, gowns splattered with wax drips from hundreds of candles, gloves stiff with sweat. They boiled, scrubbed, dried, and starched until every piece looked new again. In winter, the laundries were suffocating with steam. In summer, they were unbearable ovens. These women worked long past midnight to make sure the gowns were pristine by dawn. And here's your sarcastic reminder. Your silk gown says wealth. The woman scrubbing it at 3 a.m? She's the reason it didn't rot off you. The irony of Victorian fashion was that it was meant to symbolize purity and order, but behind the scenes, it generated chaos and exhaustion. Crinolines could catch fire if women stood too close to candles. Corsets left bruises and fainting spells. Fabrics dragged across filthy palace floors, gathering dust and soot, only to be scraped clean again by women who were paid a fraction of the cost of the gown's trim. The scale of it all was immense. For every queen in satin, there were dozens of women ensuring that satin survived the night. Dressers, seamstresses, laundresses, starchers, and menders worked in endless cycles. They repaired torn hems, replaced missing beads, and ironed pleats until their arms trembled. Few of their names were recorded, but without them, palace fashion would have collapsed into tatters in a matter of weeks. Now imagine yourself in their world. You're standing in the laundry late at night, lanterns casting shadows on damp walls. Steam rises from vats where linens bubble like cauldrons. The air stings with the sharp bite of soap. Your hands are cracked, your apron soaked. You lift a gown from the water, heavy and dripping, then heave it onto a table to scrub at the stains. By dawn, it must be dried, pressed, and ready, as though it had never been worn. No one will thank you. At best, no one will notice. Upstairs, of course, the gowns sparkle as intended. Guests gasp at the sight of jewels glinting against lace, skirts sweeping across parquet floors, silks shimmering in candlelight. They see effortless beauty, not the sweat and toil hidden beneath it. And that was the whole point. The palace existed to project an illusion. That power was easy, that wealth was eternal, that monarchy never cracked at the seams. But you, now listening in the quiet, know better. You know that every shimmering gown was a fragile thing, held together by pins, starch, and the weary hands of women who labored in silence. You know that the illusion of majesty depended on laundresses working through the night, on maids lacing corsets with sore fingers, on dressers whispering cues in the shadows. So the next time you picture a Victorian palace ball, remember this. It wasn't just the Queen's gown sweeping the floor. It was the invisible labor of dozens who made sure the gown gleamed, the corset held, and the illusion remained intact. Behind every jewel was soap, sweat, and starch. Behind every tiara was a tired woman with a washboard. Romantic, isn't it? If there's one thing Queen Victoria was determined to prove, it was that she wasn't just the ruler of an empire, she was the mother of it too. With 9 children in just 17 years, the palace nurseries were as busy as the kitchens. Buckingham Palace, Windsor, and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight all echoed at one time or another with the cries, giggles, and tantrums of princes and princesses destined to marry into the dynasties of Europe. But before you start picturing cozy bedtime scenes of Victoria tucking her children in, let's clear something up. The Queen of England didn't do night feedings. Like most aristocratic women of the time, she outsourced much of motherhood to a small army of nannies, governesses, and wet nurses. The Queen's main responsibility was producing the children. Raising them was another matter entirely. Imagine yourself now in the palace nursery. The air smells faintly of warm milk and beeswax polish. Toys are scattered across a rug. Wooden horses, tin soldiers, rag dolls. The walls are lined with cribs draped in lace canopies. And moving quietly between them are the real architects of royal childhood, the nurses and nannies. These women were selected with care. Wet nurses were prized not only for their ability to provide milk, but for their health, discretion, and willingness to sever ties with their own families to live within the palace walls. You're rocked to sleep not by your mother, but by a nurse chosen for her ability to produce milk and keep secrets. The Queen did, of course, take an interest in her children, but she was frank about her mixed feelings. In letters and journals, she sometimes complained about the chaos of family life, even describing babies as frog-like or unattractive. Maternal warmth was not Victoria's strongest quality. Yet she also enjoyed family rituals, sketching her children, watching them play in the gardens, and staging portraits that presented her as both sovereign and mother. Prince Albert, on the other hand, threw himself into fatherhood with characteristic German precision. He designed educational programs, set timetables, and imposed a strict sense of discipline. If you were one of the royal children, you'd grow up with a father who oversaw your studies in languages, sciences, and religion, and who believed that your every action reflected on the crown. Fun, in other words, was not the top priority. Still, palace nurseries weren't joyless. Accounts describe the children racing through corridors, sliding on polished floors, or sneaking down to the kitchens in search of treats. Servants indulged them, sometimes against strict instructions. And if you listen closely in your imagination, you can hear laughter echoing off the high ceilings, punctuated by the sharp click of a nanny's shoes as she restores order. The sheer scale of it all was staggering. 9 royal children meant 9 sets of tutors, 9 sets of wardrobes, and 9 sets of demands. Laundry rooms churned with baby linens. Seamstresses stitched endless tiny garments. Governesses prepared lessons in everything from piano to history. The nursery wasn't just a room, it was an institution. And through it all, the staff bore the weight. Wet nurses lived under constant scrutiny. Nannies endured temper tantrums and long hours. Governesses had to balance discipline with affection, all while knowing that a single complaint from the Queen could end their career. Yet many of these women formed genuine bonds with their royal charges, bonds that often lasted longer than those between the children and their parents. Take a moment to picture yourself as one of these children. You wake to the sound of footsteps in the nursery, the rustle of skirts as a nurse leans over your crib. She lifts you, her hands firm but gentle, and rocks you against her shoulder. The Queen is elsewhere, perhaps in council, perhaps at a concert. But here, in this quiet corner of the palace, your world is defined by the touch of someone whose name will never appear in history books. Sarcasm fits nicely here. Victorian parenting, outsourcing before it was cool. Of course, these royal children weren't just children. They were dynastic assets. Each marriage was carefully calculated to strengthen ties with Europe's ruling families. Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe, not because she read bedtime stories, but because her descendants ended up on thrones from Berlin to Moscow. Childhood, in that sense, was less about toys and more about destiny. But destiny didn't erase humanity. Letters from the children reveal affection, frustration, and longing. They quarreled with their parents, complained about strict tutors, and confided in the very servants who raised them. Some adored Albert's orderliness, others rebelled against it. Some felt smothered by Victoria's expectations, others longed for her attention. And here's where the palace illusion cracks again. Behind the portraits of a perfectly ordered royal family, behind the photographs of Victoria surrounded by her brood, there were tears, disagreements, and the occasional slammed door. In other words, it was a family, just one with a lot more velvet. So when you imagine palace nurseries in the Victorian age, don't picture only lace curtains and royal toys. Picture also the nurses awake at midnight, the nannies chasing after mischievous princes, the governess bent over books by candlelight. Picture the invisible hands that guided the children who would one day marry into Europe's thrones. And picture the Queen herself, distant yet present, a woman both mother and monarch, whose definition of family life was shaped as much by duty as by love. That was palace childhood, part nursery rhyme, part political chessboard, and entirely dependent on the people who rarely received credit. If you've listened this far without subscribing, you're doing to me exactly what history did to those nurses and nannies, erasing the effort. Don't let this story vanish. Subscribe, and at least one of us gets remembered. If there's one thing the Victorians understood, it was theater. Not just in playhouses, but in everyday monarchy. A palace wasn't just a home, it was a stage, and the monarch was always on display, whether she was waving from a balcony, reviewing troops, or yes, eating dinner in front of strangers. Let's start with the balcony, because it's the part you still recognize today. The famous central balcony at Buckingham Palace was added during Victoria's reign specifically for appearances before the crowd. Imagine standing there, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of Londoners, craning your neck for a glimpse of the Queen. At last, the curtains twitch, and there she is, tiny, stiff-backed, perhaps waving, perhaps just staring. The cheer rises like a wave through the crowd, echoing off the stone. For a moment, You're part of history. For a moment, you feel the monarchy belongs to you. And then the curtains close, and you realize you've spent 2 hours waiting for a 5-second hand flutter. That was the power of ritual. It gave the people a spectacle, even if the spectacle was just waving. Now imagine yourself inside at a grand couvert, a public dinner. The Queen and her family sit at a raised table under glittering chandeliers. Below them, rows of courtiers, politicians, and foreign dignitaries strain to catch her attention. Music swells, candles flicker, silver gleams. It all looks magnificent, until you notice what's actually happening. The Queen is eating soup, carefully, deliberately, spoon after spoon. Courtiers lean forward as though each sip carries divine significance. You shift in your seat, wondering if anyone else feels the absurdity. Nothing says loyalty like staring at your monarch chewing. But this was monarchy as theater. The meal wasn't about food, it was about hierarchy. The Queen ate, and everyone else watched. Servants moved like clockwork, placing dishes, removing them, pouring wine. You were there to be seen, to bow at the right moments, to clap politely when the orchestra paused. The grandeur distracted from the dull reality. Then there were troop reviews and parades. Picture yourself standing on the parade ground at Windsor or Hyde Park. Soldiers line up in perfect formation, uniforms immaculate, rifles gleaming in the sun. Drums beat, horses snort, standards flutter. And there, riding past in a carriage or perched stiffly on a reviewing stand, is Queen Victoria. She doesn't need to say much. The symbolism does the work. Thousands of troops moving in flawless rhythm, all for her. For you, the onlooker, it's impressive for about 10 minutes. Then your feet start to ache. The sun beats down, and you realize you're watching grown men march in circles because the monarch wants a show of loyalty. Romantic, isn't it? But again, the illusion mattered. To see the Queen at dinner or on the balcony or reviewing troops was to be reminded that she was not just a woman, but a symbol. Every gesture, every appearance, every bite of soup was invested with meaning. Monarchy survived not because it was efficient, but because it convinced people it was eternal. And of course, these spectacles carried risks. Appear too rarely, and you looked aloof. Appear too often, and you cheapen the magic. Victoria struggled with this balance, especially after Albert's death, when she withdrew from public life. Crowds grew restless when the curtains stayed shut, when the balcony remained empty. The monarchy's power was tied to ritual, and when the ritual broke, the illusion faltered. Now, step into the shoes of a guest at one of these events. You're ushered into a grand hall with hundreds of others. Your feet echo on marble floors as you approach the dining chamber. Servants guide you to your seat. You catch sight of the Queen at the far end, small in stature but commanding in presence. Candles blaze overhead, the air warm with perfume and smoke. You wait and wait, and finally she lifts her spoon. The entire room exhales. This is the moment. You are watching history eat. Or maybe you're standing in the courtyard, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the crowd. It's hot, your hat is askew, and someone's elbow is firmly lodged in your side. Children cry, dogs bark, hawkers shout. Then the balcony doors open, and the roar of the crowd drowns out everything. For a heartbeat, you see her. Then the doors close, and the magic is gone. All that's left is the shuffle home, the memory of a glimpse, and the sense that you were part of something bigger. That's what court spectacles did. They filled people with awe, even if the reality was tedious. They gave order to a messy world. They convinced thousands that monarchy wasn't just a system, it was sacred theater. And like all theater, the secret was never to let the audience see the strings. So, the next time you picture Victorian pageantry, remember the reality. The balcony wave that lasted seconds. The troupe review that numbed your feet. The banquet where all you did was watch a queen chew her way through soup. Glamorous, yes, but also gloriously dull. And that dullness was part of the point. It showed stability, continuity, and tradition. Because nothing says loyalty like staring at your monarch chewing. If public balcony waves and banquets were for the masses, then the real theater of monarchy happened indoors, in the drawing rooms, where diplomacy was performed with handshakes, carefully rehearsed speeches, and an awful lot of waiting around. Imagine the scene. A foreign delegation has arrived. They've traveled thousands of miles, endured seasickness, dust, and endless formalities, all for this, to be ushered into a gilded room at Buckingham or Windsor, where the Queen of England waits beneath a canopy of velvet and gold. The drawing room itself is immaculate. Every chair polished, every painting positioned, every chandelier blazing. You step onto carpets so thick they almost swallow your shoes. The air smells faintly of beeswax and lilies. Behind the scenes, servants have been up since dawn, dusting, sweeping, arranging flowers, ensuring not a single candle sputters at the wrong moment. The illusion must be seamless. And then it begins. The door opens, names are announced, and in come the dignitaries, ambassadors, princes, chiefs, or envoys from far-off lands. They bow, they curtsy, they step forward to shake the Queen's hand. And here's your moment of sarcasm. Behind every handshake was a servant making sure the punch bowl didn't collapse. Because while the spotlight was on royalty and guests, the quiet ballet of service kept the whole performance intact. One famous example was the 1734 reception of Cherokee leader Tomochichi at Kensington Palace. Earlier than Victoria's reign, yes, but the traditions carried forward. By Victoria's day, similar receptions brought delegations from India, Africa, and the Americas, all part of Britain's expanding imperial reach. For the visitors, these moments were weighted with politics, culture, and diplomacy. For the palace, they were carefully staged theater, lavish enough to impress, controlled enough to prevent embarrassment. Now, place yourself in the room. You're standing among the crowd of courtiers, stiff in your collar, trying not to fidget. The Queen greets a dignitary, perhaps with a few polite words, translated if necessary, while musicians in the corner play discreetly. The atmosphere is heavy with expectation. Everyone is watching, calculating the symbolism of every gesture. Did she shake his hand firmly enough? Did she smile too much? Did she ignore him too quickly? Entire newspaper columns would be written about such details. Meanwhile, servants glide silently through the background. One replenishes the punch. Another straightens a chair that no one will sit in. Footmen carry trays of glasses, moving with mechanical precision. The goal is simple. Nothing must distract from the performance of diplomacy. No tray dropped, no candle guttering, no floor squeaking. The guests, of course, were just as aware of the stakes. For them, being received at a palace was validation, a recognition of their importance. Their clothing was scrutinized, their manners noted, their gifts examined. Imagine bringing an ornate piece of craftwork across the sea, only to watch it disappear into the palace collection, barely glanced at before the next guest arrived. And yet, the spectacle worked. Britain projected itself as the center of the world. a place where foreign leaders traveled to seek favor or recognition. The monarchy appeared majestic, eternal, unshakable, even if the pipes downstairs were groaning and the kitchens were sending up smoke. Now imagine yourself as one of the servants. You're balancing a silver tray, sweat beading under your wig, hoping no one notices your hands shake. You watch the dignitaries pass, knowing you'll never be remembered, but also knowing the success of the evening depends on you. If the wine is cold, if the candles burn evenly, if the musicians play without faltering, the illusion holds. If not, well, your career might end faster than the handshake you just witnessed. The irony is that diplomacy in drawing rooms wasn't really about conversation. Most of the words exchanged were formalities. The real power was in the setting, the golden ceilings, the glittering gowns, the bowing courtiers. Foreign visitors weren't meant to leave with brilliant ideas. They were meant to leave with awe. They were meant to write home about the Queen's composure, the grandeur of the palace, the wealth of Britain. And so, for hours, guests shuffled in and out. Some were dazzled, some were bored, some were quietly exhausted by the endless bowing and standing. But all of them were participants in the theater of monarchy. Think of it this way. A handshake in a Victorian drawing room was never just a handshake, it was empire in miniature. The Queen's gesture said, "Britain acknowledges you, and by acknowledging you, Britain proves its own supremacy." The servant's silence said, "This world is effortless," even though every effort of the household was bent to keeping it that way. So when you picture these receptions, don't just see royalty and dignitaries. See also the dozens of unseen hands that kept the illusion alive. The candle snuffers, the footmen with trays, the housemaids who polished until their knuckles bled. The grandeur of diplomacy rested on their labor, their invisibility, their perfection. And as you sit here now, drifting gently into the story, you know the truth. Behind every handshake was a servant making sure the punch bowl didn't collapse. If the drawing rooms were for politics, then the ballrooms were for pleasure, or at least, what passed for pleasure, when you were corseted within an inch of your ribs and expected to smile through it. Music, dance, and entertainment were the lifeblood of court society. They gave the illusion that monarchy wasn't just duty and ritual, but also charm, grace, and a little sparkle. Let's set the scene. Imagine entering the ballroom at Buckingham Palace on the night of a grand ball. The chandeliers blaze with hundreds of candles, each flame mirrored in gilt-framed mirrors until the room seems to glow. The parquet floors gleam, freshly polished by servants who spent hours on their knees with beeswax. Musicians tune violins in the corner, their bows rasping across strings in little nervous flourishes. The air is thick with perfume, powder, and anticipation. Then the guests arrive. Ladies descend the stairs in shimmering whalebone gowns, skirts ballooning with crinoline until they resemble floating bell jars. From above, it looks like an army of pastel-colored ghosts drifting across the floor. Each gown weighs a small ton, each hem sweeps like a royal train, and each corset pinches until you can barely draw breath. They couldn't sit, they couldn't bend, but by God, they looked elegant while fainting, and faint they often did. Between the heat of the candles, the press of bodies, and the tightness of corsets, women dropped with alarming frequency. This was so common that fainting couches were placed discreetly in side rooms, attended by maids ready with smelling salts. The faint wasn't considered a scandal. It was almost part of the entertainment. Now picture yourself in the middle of the dance floor. A quadrille is called. The music begins, sprightly and precise. You take your partner's hand, bow stiffly, and step into the pattern. Around you, dozens of couples move in time, skirts swishing, boots clicking, jewels flashing in candlelight. From a distance, it looks harmonious. Up close, you notice the sweat glistening at temples, the whispered reminders. Left foot, now turn. The desperate effort to keep composure while gasping for air. The Queen herself adored music and often hosted concerts. Victoria was a pianist, Albert a keen supporter of the arts. Musicians of international renown were invited to perform, their notes filling halls where the echo of power usually reigned. For an evening, politics was set aside, replaced by sonatas, operas, and songs that lulled the court into a haze of refinement. But even here, the entertainment was never free of duty. To attend a concert was to be seen attending a concert. To clap at the right moments was as important as to clap at all. And then there were the maids of honor, young aristocratic women whose role was partly ceremonial, partly decorative. They fluttered at the edges of balls and receptions, charming guests, adding sparkle to the Queen's household. For them, the ballroom was a stage of opportunity. A well-executed dance, a graceful curtsy, a smile at the right gentleman. These were investments in a future marriage, perhaps even a noble match. But the pressure was immense. One stumble on the dance floor, one overheard giggle at the wrong time, and the opportunity could vanish. You, listening now, might imagine that these balls were thrilling affairs, filled with laughter and joy. The truth is more complex. Yes, there was music, there was movement, there was glamour, but there was also exhaustion, obligation, and a keen awareness that everyone was being judged. Every gesture carried weight. Every gown was compared. Every dance was watched, not just for elegance, but for political symbolism. And of course, there were the servants. While the guests danced, footmen lined the walls, standing motionless for hours. Maids scurried to replace candles that sputtered. Musicians played until their arms ached, repeating the same reels and waltzes long past midnight. When the dancing finally stopped, it was servants again who swept up the wax strips, polished the floors, and aired out the room, heavy with perfume and sweat. By dawn, the ballroom was once more an empty shell, waiting for its next transformation. Imagine yourself now, standing at the edge of that glittering hall. The music swells, the dancers spin, jewels catch the light. For a moment, you're dazzled, and then you notice the cracks. A woman's pale face as she sinks to a couch. A man tugging at a collar too tight. The weary glance of a servant holding a tray. You realize that behind the illusion of grace lies strain, fatigue, and endless work. But that was the essence of Victorian Palace entertainment. Spectacle first, comfort second. The monarchy didn't just rule, it dazzled. Balls and concerts reminded everyone that the crown was more than politics. It was culture, elegance, refinement. Even if the women fainted, even if the servants staggered home at dawn, the illusion remained. So, when you think of palace balls, don't just picture glitter and grace. Picture also the fainting couches, the aching feet, the musicians wiping sweat from their brows. Picture the maids of honor smiling through exhaustion, corsets digging into their ribs. Picture the guests clapping dutifully at yet another sonata, thinking longingly of their beds. That was palace entertainment. Elegant misery, choreographed into beauty. They couldn't sit, they couldn't bend, but by God, They looked elegant while fainting. Palaces may have been built to awe, but they were never built for comfort. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the changing of the seasons. Victorian palaces were less homes and more stone refrigerators in winter, greenhouses in summer. Marble looks impressive, yes, but try living with it year-round and you'll quickly realize it's not exactly cozy. Let's start with winter. Picture Buckingham Palace in January. Outside, London fog drifts low, thick with coal smoke from thousands of chimneys. Inside, the palace feels little better. Fires roar in the grates, but the ceilings are so high and the rooms so vast that the warmth escapes almost instantly. You walk down a corridor and the air bites your skin despite the tapestries on the walls. Candles flicker against condensation that runs down window panes like thin streams of ice. Servants shuffle in thick woolen clothes, their breath visible as they carry trays of coal. And yes, even queens couldn't stop their wine from freezing in the glass. That actually happened at Windsor Castle, where a guest once reported that drinks on the royal table turned to slush before they could be finished. Imagine raising a toast while your goblet quietly ices over. Majestic, perhaps, but hardly comfortable. Now imagine you're one of the palace staff. You wake before dawn to light dozens of fires, your fingers stiff with cold as you strike flint against steel. You lug coal scuttles through endless corridors, knowing that by the time you've reached the last fireplace, the first one has already begun to die down. No matter how many flames you feed, the palace remains a drafty icebox. Your boots squeak on frozen floors, your apron stiff with frost. Glamour fades quickly when your teeth chatter in rhythm with the bells. For the royal family, winter life meant layering, layer upon layer of wool, silk, and fur. Women wore shawls indoors. Men wore cloaks even at dinner. Curtains were drawn tight against drafts, and footmen stood ready with hot water bottles wrapped in cloth. But no matter how many precautions, the cold seeped in. You couldn't escape it. Palaces were designed to impress visitors, not to insulate their inhabitants. And then came summer, which was no relief. Those same thick walls that trapped cold in winter now trapped heat. Windows were heavy, ventilation poor, and the air grew stifling. Picture yourself stepping into a drawing room in July. The curtains hang limp, the candles sag in their holders, and the air smells faintly of wax, perfume, and sweat. Guests fan themselves with desperate elegance, while musicians play on, perspiring under their wigs. Servants tried their best to alleviate the heat. Ice keepers dug blocks from underground stores, wrapping them in straw to survive the journey. Bowls of ice were placed in rooms to cool the air, though they melted into puddles within hours. Windows were thrown open, only to let in flies and the smell of the Thames, a reminder that sometimes fresh air wasn't actually fresher. But step outside, and the gardens told a different story. The Victorians adored their palace gardens in summer. At Buckingham, manicured lawns stretched wide, fountains sparkled, and flowers exploded in color. At Windsor, terraces overlooked the Thames, while Balmoral boasted wild Highland beauty. On a good day, wandering through these grounds felt like stepping into a painting. Roses heavy with scent, bees humming lazily, sunlight dancing on fountains. For a brief moment, you could forget the suffocating air inside and imagine the palace as paradise. Of course, you weren't the only one wandering. Servants moved discreetly along gravel paths, trimming hedges, watering beds, sweeping away fallen leaves. Even paradise required constant maintenance. And for every elegant stroll taken by the Queen or her guests, There were gardeners, grooms, and stable boys sweating in the background to keep the illusion alive. Now place yourself in the shoes of a guest invited for a summer party. You step into the gardens, blinking against the sun. A string quartet plays under a striped awning. Tables are laid with lemonade and sponge cake. You smile, nod politely, and pretend the air isn't clinging to you like a damp cloak. Everyone around you is equally uncomfortable, but no one dares admit it. This is the palace, after all. If the queen can endure it, so can you. That was palace life in the seasons. Endure and pretend. In winter, you wrapped yourself in furs and drank wine before it froze. In summer, you fanned yourself while sweat rolled beneath your collar. And through it all, you smiled, bowed, and carried on as though discomfort were invisible. For the servants, of course, there was no pretending. They worked in the freezing kitchens, in the stifling laundries, in the damp cellars. They hauled coal in January and lugged ice in July. Their bodies absorbed what the palaces refused to shield. The royals complained about drafts. The servants lived in them. So when you imagine Victorian palace life, don't just picture balls and banquets. Picture also the frozen goblets, the dripping walls, the suffocating summers. Picture the paradox of luxury built without comfort, majesty maintained in spite of misery. The palace was eternal, yes, but it was never truly warm, never truly cool, never truly kind to those who lived inside. Yes, even queens couldn't stop their wine from freezing in the glass. And if you don't subscribe, this story will freeze here too, buried by the algorithm, forgotten like yesterday's banquet scraps. Don't let it vanish. If the first decades of Victoria's reign were marked by glittering balls, bustling nurseries, and palace spectacles, then December of 1861 changed everything. Prince Albert, her beloved husband, died at the age of 42 after a short illness. And with him, the lively rhythm of palace life collapsed. Imagine it. Buckingham Palace, once echoing with music and chatter, suddenly cloaked in silence. The grand chandeliers still blazed, the marble floors still gleamed, but the atmosphere shifted. Curtains were drawn, mirrors were draped. Black crepe appeared everywhere, a constant reminder that joy had been replaced with grief. The palace that once felt like a stage now resembled a mausoleum. For Victoria, Albert's death was not just personal tragedy, it was the end of her world. She retreated from public life, wearing black for the rest of her days. She refused to set aside mourning, and so the palaces followed her lead. The halls that once hosted balls became heavy with gloom. The balcony doors stayed closed. Receptions dwindled. Buckingham grew somber, a place where joy was smothered under drapery. Now picture yourself as a servant in this new world. Before Albert's death, you might have been busy preparing for feasts, arranging flowers for balls, or polishing banisters for receptions. Now your tasks are different, hanging mourning crepe across windows, covering mirrors, replacing bright draperies with black fabric. You haul trunks of somber clothing, stitch endless veils, and polish silver that will sit unused in locked cupboards. The palace no longer breathes with activity, it sighs with sorrow. And of course, the workload didn't shrink. If anything, it grew. Mourning required its own rituals, constant cleaning of black fabrics, preparing memorial displays, maintaining rooms Victoria insisted remain exactly as Albert had left them. His shaving brush remained on the dressing table. His inkwell stayed on the desk. Servants had to dust and polish these relics daily. careful never to disturb the illusion that Albert might walk back in at any moment. From your perspective, the palace became both quieter and heavier. Conversations dropped to whispers. Footsteps echoed louder in the marble halls. Even the air felt different. Less perfume, more dust, more stillness. The glamour had drained away, replaced by a monotony of grief. And here comes the sarcasm. Because nothing says romance like 40 years of permanent funeral decor. Victoria's retreat had political consequences too. The monarchy seemed withdrawn, disconnected from its people. Crowds who once gathered outside the palace for balcony appearances found only closed curtains. Newspapers muttered about her absence, but still she persisted in her mourning, and still the palaces mirrored her sorrow. At Balmoral, her Highland retreat, the grief felt even sharper. Albert had loved the estate, had redesigned it, had walked its forests with her. After his death, she clung to it like a relic, surrounding herself with memories, with servants who had once served Albert, with landscapes that still bore his touch. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, she built monuments to his memory, surrounding herself with reminders of what she had lost. The palaces were no longer stages of power, they were shrines. And yet, life continued. Children grew, the empire expanded, servants worked. Balls were not gone forever. State duties eventually forced her hand, but the tone had changed. Buckingham was no longer the buzzing heart of empire it once seemed. It had become a place of restraint, shadowed by grief. Imagine being one of the royal children during these years. The palace around you feels heavy, every corner draped in black. Your mother wears mourning clothes day after day, her face set in sorrow. The laughter of childhood is stifled by the atmosphere. Even birthdays and weddings are overshadowed by the constant presence of grief. The palace itself becomes a lesson. That monarchy was not just spectacle, but endurance. And for the servants, what a strange existence it must have been. You carried out tasks with the same precision as before, but without the reward of celebration. Instead of arranging banquets, you hung black fabric. Instead of cleaning jewels for balls, you maintained relics of the dead prince. Your work kept the illusion alive, not of majesty this time, but of unending mourning. As years passed, this became the new normal. Visitors noticed the somber tone. Courtiers whispered about the Queen's isolation. The palaces, once meant to dazzle, seemed instead to mourn alongside their mistress. Buckingham no longer sparkled. Windsor felt heavy. Balmoral grew private, almost secretive. So when you think of Victorian palaces, don't just picture the grandeur of the early years. Picture also the decades when joy was subdued, when draperies stayed drawn, when servants dusted a desk that no one sat at anymore. Picture the silence, the rituals of mourning, the endless black fabric. Because in the end, the story of Victoria's palaces is not just about spectacle and splendor. It's about how those same walls absorbed grief, reflected it, and broadcast it across an empire. For nearly half a century, the monarch of the world's largest empire lived in shadow. And her palaces, magnificent as they were, became monuments to loss. Yes, even in grandeur, even in history, palaces are not immune to sorrow. By now, you've walked through the glittering halls, the grand feasts, the balls, and the balcony waves. You've seen royalty in silks and diamonds. You've listened to orchestras in candlelight, and you've watched pageantry unfold like theater. But here's the truth. None of it would have been possible without the people you weren't supposed to notice. the ones history rarely wrote down, the forgotten servants. Palaces were living machines, and their gears were ordinary men and women whose names you'll never read in textbooks. Seamstresses bent over fabric until their eyes burned, stitching gowns they could never afford to wear. Rat catchers crouched in basements, setting traps so the queen wouldn't spot whiskers darting across a ballroom. Coal haulers trudging up endless staircases, arms aching from carrying scuttles heavy enough to break a back. Few records were kept of these people. They were the invisible workforce, erased from the official image of palace life. Paintings showed chandeliers, not chambermaids. Newspapers described the queen's jewels, not the cracked hands of laundresses who scrubbed them spotless. History remembers the queen's gowns, not the women boiling them in lye until their hands cracked. Imagine yourself now slipping into those hidden corridors. The air is damp, the light dim. You hear the clang of a bucket, the scurry of boots, the muffled ring of a bell somewhere above. A seamstress hums softly as she stitches by candlelight, her shoulders hunched. A boy hauls coal up a staircase, sweat dripping despite the cold. A laundress wrings water from sheets, steam rising around her like a ghost. They move silently, invisibly, so that the palace above appears effortless. And yet their lives were anything but effortless. Hours were long. Pay was meager. Conditions were harsh. Many slept in attic rooms barely large enough for a bed, or in damp cellars that reeked of coal dust. Servants ate scraps, worked through illness, and knew that if they faltered, someone else would take their place. They endured because service offered stability, however meager, in a world where options were few. Think of the irony. The queen's gowns might require 20 yards of silk, 10 hours of dressing, and a dozen hands to prepare. But the women who ensured those gowns dazzled in the ballroom disappeared into anonymity. Their work was essential, but their names forgotten. Their fingerprints may still linger on the seams of dresses locked in museum cases today, but their stories have been lost. Now picture yourself drifting through the palace at night. The chandeliers are dark, the ballrooms silent. The guests have gone, the queen has retired. But in the kitchens, a scullery maid still scrubs pans blackened with grease. In the laundries, a woman beats linens clean on a board, arms sore, eyes heavy. In a narrow hallway, a rat catcher sets his traps, pausing to listen for skitters in the dark. The palace breathes because they are still awake. There's something almost haunting in that image. Palaces presented themselves as timeless, perfect, eternal. But their perfection rested on tired shoulders, on blistered hands, on lives spent in shadows. And those shadows deepened after Albert's death, when palace life grew quieter, more somber. For the royals, mourning meant draped curtains and black crepe. For servants, it meant even more work, sewing endless veils, polishing memorial rooms, dusting objects that could never be disturbed. You can almost hear the sigh of the laundress as she dips fabric into boiling water, steam rising to sting her face. You can almost feel the ache of the coal porter as he climbs another staircase, shoulders stooped. You can almost sense the rat catcher moving silently through dark passages, ears tuned to the scratch of tiny claws. They're not in the history books, but they were the palace's lifeblood. Without them, the illusion of grandeur would have collapsed. Without them, the banquets wouldn't have dazzled. The balls wouldn't have glittered. The queen's gowns wouldn't have gleamed. They were the threads holding the tapestry together, even if no one bothered to record their names. And here, near the end of our journey, their story matters most. Because when you strip away the gold and velvet, the palace wasn't just queens and princes. It was also maids, cooks, seamstresses, and porters. Ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives in obscurity, who gave their labor to create beauty they could never share. So as you drift deeper into this story, let the noise of the palace fade. Picture instead the quiet clink of a pot, the soft scrape of a brush, the steady stitch of a needle in candlelight. Those sounds were the true heartbeat of the palace, even if no one ever applauded them. History remembers the queen's gowns, but you tonight can remember the women who boiled them. By the final decades of the 19th century, Victorian palaces were no longer just homes or even stages for ritual. They had become symbols, architectural billboards for an empire that wanted the world to know it was not only powerful, but eternal. The monarchy had endured decades of change, Albert's death, and Victoria's long seclusion. Yet the palaces stood, stone and marble testaments to the idea that Britain itself was unshakable. Buckingham Palace was at the center of this transformation. By the 1890s, its role as a private residence mattered less than its role as a public emblem. The balcony became iconic, a shorthand for monarchy itself. Whenever Victoria, or later her successors, stepped onto it, the act resonated far beyond London. Crowds gathered not to see a woman, but to see what she represented. The palace had become less about domestic life and more about image. But image required upkeep. By the turn of the century, the facade of Buckingham looked tired. The Khan's stone used in Nash's redesign had weathered badly, giving the palace a darker, uneven appearance. And so, in the early 20th century, King George V ordered the facade to be reclad in Portland stone, the same pale stone used for the new Victoria Memorial outside. The result was a palace that looked fresher, whiter, and more fitting for a national symbol. Pause on that image for a moment. You've just endured decades of cold corridors, creaking pipes, and the occasional rat in the pantry. And the solution? Not fixing the plumbing, but building a massive marble monument outside. Because nothing hides your plumbing problems like a giant marble fountain. The Victoria Memorial, unveiled in 1911, stood directly in front of the palace gates, a towering white monument topped with a gilded statue of the winged Victory. Around it sprawled fountains, steps, and allegorical figures representing truth, motherhood, and empire. Tourists today still flock to it, but at the time it sent a very deliberate message. That monarchy, and Victoria in particular, had become synonymous with British power. The palace and the memorial together formed a visual pair, home and monument, symbol and shrine. You might think of it as the monarchy's stone crown, placed permanently in the heart of London. The palace was no longer just a stage for banquets and balls. It was the backdrop for empire itself. Every postcard, every painting, every description of London began to feature Buckingham as shorthand for Britain. Now put yourself there at the end of the 19th century. You stand in the mall, looking up at the palace. Crowds line the street. Carriages rattle. Flags whip in the breeze. Above the gates, the Victoria Memorial gleams in the sun. The palace looms, freshly polished, its facade bright and smooth. For a moment, you forget the drafts inside, the smells in the corridors, the tired laundresses scrubbing at gowns. All you see is majesty. All you feel is permanence. And that was the point. Palaces in the Victorian age had shifted from functional homes into symbols. Windsor, with its medieval towers, reminded the world that the monarchy was ancient. Balmoral, nestled in the Highlands, projected rustic charm and imperial romance. Osborne House, with its Italianate towers, spoke of personal taste and family life. And Buckingham, looming over London, declared itself the empire's heart. But remember, symbols are illusions. The palace was no more comfortable in 1899 than it had been in 1839. Pipes still leaked. Rooms still froze in winter and suffocated in summer. Servants still trudged unseen to keep the show running. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was the image, the painted surface, the marble veneer, the balcony wave. The palace's reality was hidden. Its meaning was broadcast. Think of it this way. If the early years of Victoria's reign were about building palaces into functioning homes, the later years were about cementing them as myths. The monarchy didn't need to prove it could throw a banquet anymore. It needed to prove it could endure. And so, the architecture reflected that endurance. Stone facades, marble monuments, endless photography and paintings, all designed to suggest something unchanging, even as the world shifted around it. And yet, inside those walls, humanity remained. Victoria in her widow's black, moving through quiet corridors, children laughing in nurseries, servants lighting fires, scrubbing floors, stitching gowns. The symbol outside might be flawless, but the life inside remained complicated, messy, human. That's what makes the story of Victorian palaces so compelling. They weren't perfect. They were never perfect. They were messy machines dressed in gold leaf, full of contradictions, glamorous and grimy, eternal and fragile, dazzling and drafty. So, as you sit here now, drifting through this story, take a final walk in your imagination. Step back onto the Mall, stand among the crowd, and look up at Buckingham Palace as the 19th century drew to a close. The flags ripple, the gates glint, the memorial gleams. The palace rises behind it all, grand, aloof, untouchable. For the people around you, it is a symbol of empire, of continuity, of Britain itself. But you, after this long journey, you know the truth. You know that behind those smooth Portland stones are damp walls. Behind those glittering chandeliers are coal-stained servants. Behind that famous balcony wave is a drafty corridor, a half-finished building, and a monarchy clinging to illusion. And that's the legacy of Victorian palaces. Not perfection, but performance. They were never fairy tales, never cozy homes. They were stages, sometimes dazzling, sometimes absurd, where royalty lived, and where an empire projected itself to the world. So the next time you see Buckingham on a postcard, or Windsor on a calendar, or Balmoral in a photograph, remember this. The beauty was real, the power was real, but so were the smells, the cold, the rats, and the laundresses who worked until their hands bled. Symbols endure, people fade, palaces were both, because nothing hides your plumbing problems like a giant marble fountain outside. And so, we come to the end of our walk through Victorian palaces. You've stepped through marble halls, peeked behind velvet curtains, and smelled, well, things the history books usually leave out. You've seen balls that shimmered with chandeliers, dinners where 70 dishes grew cold, and nurseries filled with more nannies than mothers. You've heard the faint ring of bells calling servants through hidden passages, and you've watched laundresses bend over steaming tubs long after midnight. Tonight, as you drift off, remember, palaces were not fairy tales. They were drafty, smelly, crowded places where servants carried the weight of royal splendor. They looked eternal on the outside, but inside they cracked, leaked, and creaked like any other house, just on a much larger, more exhausting scale. Be grateful you don't fall asleep to the sound of bells summoning you to carry someone else's chamber pot. Be grateful you don't wake to frozen wine, suffocating rooms, or the knowledge that your entire job is making sure champagne stays at the right temperature. Palaces dazzled, yes, but their magic came at a cost, paid by those who never wore crowns. As your eyes grow heavy, let those images soften into dream. Whalebone gowns drifting across parquet floors like ghosts, the muffled shuffle of footmen in endless corridors, the faint glow of chandeliers fading into candle smoke. Think of the palace not as a monument, but as a theater, grand on the surface, fragile behind the curtains. And while you drift away into sleep, remember this one last thing. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe. Because if you don't, this story sinks quietly into the oubliette of the algorithm, buried like the names of the laundresses and coal porters who made the illusion of royalty possible. Sleep well, and don't forget to subscribe. Because if you don't, the palace rats win, and they've had enough victories already. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and pinned comment. Sleep well.